was K-Bank, all the stuff that they did here in the 1950s and the 1960s. I wasn't that aware that it's kind of been like 5 or 6 famous studios with a lot of music that's been recorded here. K-Bank was actually formed right after World War II, and just for a bit of historical perspective, recording technology really kind of started in the teens and the 20s. It was very, very primitive. It was still very primitive in the 1930s. And then after World War II, there were a lot of people that came out of the war with experience in radio and broadcasting. There was a lot of people that had been in the military. I never get nervous when I play, but I get a little nervous when I talk. I just start taking giant gulps of air. But this sort of thing, it basically existed for about 50 years, maybe 60 years, where you could build these enormous studios and make hit records. And you can't really do that anymore. The technology has gone to recording stuff in your bedroom, on your laptop. Yeah, boo. This isn't being live casted or anything.
No.
We don't want to marginalize his laptop demographic. They're sensitive.
But K-Bank started with Vern Bank and his wife Kay Bank in 1946, but not here. This was originally a theater, and it was converted by a very famous recording engineer, producer, a guy named Bruce Sweden. Is that how you pronounce his last name? Sweden, something like that? How is it?
Sweden.
Sweden, okay, all right. And this was originally the Sweden recording studio, starting in about 1953. And only for a few years, but there's some photos of some very famous jazz performers recording here. I didn't know that until today. That's pretty impressive. Vern and K-Bank bought this place in 1957, and it was K-Bank Studios for about 10 years. And that was where just an enormous number of the records that we love, these kind of Minnesota rock and roll records and country records and all sorts of other type of records were recorded here in this room. And I should also point out that it used to be a lot bigger as it went on. It was Universal Audio Studio from 1967 and 1970. It was Mike Side from 1970 to 1973. Is that when you were here, Dale? Dale Minton? Oh, okay. But I know that Dale Minton of the Gestures, like he ran this place, right, for a few years?
Under Cookhouse.
Oh, okay. Cookhouse was 1973 to 1984. And then Nicollet Studios was 1984 to 1988. And I think there was a lot of Minnesota alternative rock, punk rock kind of stuff, Husker Du, The Replacements, Soul Asylum, that kind of stuff recorded here. This is pretty amazing to have this many lives of one room. And then it's been Creation Audio ever since 1988. But originally the studio was about twice this size. It was a huge room. And I guess they remodeled in the early 80s. Is that right? And late 80s to be the room that we're looking at. So this is sort of half of the original room that K-Bank was. When we talk about old school recording studios, I like to say there were 2 types of studios. One was the studio like Sam Phillips, Sun Records, was really cobbled together. It was like, this is a guy that worked at a radio station and he bought used radio station equipment. It was not great equipment to begin with, but it was something, and he could make records with it, and he made a lot of hit records with 3 or 4 microphones, very primitive setup. The other type of studio, and to put it in perspective, a recording studio back in those days was something that you could make a lot of money doing. I mean, when I talked about how they don't make studios like this anymore, they made studios back in the old days because you could make a ton of money with a recording studio. It seems like a bizarre concept now, doesn't it? But the other type of studio are what I call the Germanic studios. And there are these enormous studios that are beautifully designed with all this incredible top-of-the-line technology. And K-Bank Studios was one of those studios. When I look at the photos and I look at the equipment list of stuff they used to have, this is a place that had Neumann microphones and Longevin preamps and Pultec EQs and Universal Audio tube compressors and Ampex 3-track machines. They advertised that they had a Scully record lathe where they could cut records. And just to put it in perspective, in the 1950s, a brand new Scully lathe, which is what you needed to take your music from a tape to a record, cost $8,500. And I think you could buy 2 or 3 brand new 1957 Chevys for that kind of money. So that was a ton of money that you could invest into a studio and pay for real estate and still make a lot of money. I mean, that's a crazy thing to think about because you literally cannot do that today. And even in the 1980s, you know, people would buy these $1 million Neve and SSL boards. You can't do that anymore. Those days are long gone. But it's great that this place is still a studio and it still exists, and we can be here today to celebrate these 60 years of history.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just to sort of put a note on that, you know, these guys that built these Germanic studios, they usually built them to record orchestras, weddings, you know, civic events, maybe jazz. But then the damnedest thing happened, rock and roll happened, and they were selling millions and millions and millions and millions of records. And you could have a record come out and immediately have orders for like 100,000 records. And so a lot of these kind of studios began offering rock and roll bands to come in. And I believe that K-Bank was fairly unique in that they started their own pressing plant where they pressed their own records, and they would offer this deal to the bands. I was reading this on the internet. For $395, you could come in and record a couple of songs. You could get the tape and 500 records, and they would send 100 of them out to radio station DJs, and they would just press the records at a place down there just a couple miles away. I wish that sort of place existed today. That sounds pretty cool. Especially for $395. And one thing that I want to talk about is the fidelity of the stuff that came out of here. I mean, part of the reason I'm a recording engineer, I have my own studio, and one of the things that I've been obsessed about is just how damn good all the records sound that were recorded at K-Bank. And in particular, when I first heard Surfin' Bird, this is a record that basically every 8-year-old kid loves Surfin' Bird because it pisses their parents off. And I would play that song over and over and over again to drive my parents crazy. Thanks, Tony. But even at that young age, I was like, man, those drums sound like cannons going off. And you know, when you listen to the other Trashman records, they're just, the fidelity on those records is incredible. The band was great, obviously, but coming in here to this room, recording...
Say it again.
The band was great. The fidelity was incredible. Well, and the proof of that is that we're here 60 years later talking about it. Right?
Yeah.
And I would say that even, you know, from the earliest days through the latest days, one of the uniting factors of this studio was that, man, everything that came out of here sounded really, really good. And probably one of the reasons is that there was a very, very acclaimed, well-known engineer, a guy named Tom Jung. Am I pronouncing that name correctly? And he started here pretty young, right? He was recording teenage bands in the early 1960s. And then he went on to form a studio called Studio 80, right? Sound 80, thank you. And then a Digital Music Products, is that right? DMP. But I know him because he's literally one of the most well-known engineers ever. I mean, he's just nationally known. And so he got his start right here. I believe he was Tom Jung the engineer on Surfin' Bird?
He was, yeah.
All right.
Run.
And Run. Amazing. So Tony and I were talking, and Tony has a lot of really, really great stories. But I believe was Susie Baby might have been the first rock and roll hit cut here, I'm not sure. But the first just ginormous #1 smash hit that was recorded here was 6 Days on the Road by Dave Dudley. Right? Tony tells me he was in the room when that happened. He was just hanging out at the studio watching Dave Dudley record, and I love the story that you told me that as soon as they got done recording that and listened to the playback, you guys were all like, yep, that's a big hit.
You just know it.
You just know it, right? And was that a little bit before Surfing Bird. It wasn't.
Yeah, and there was Susie Baby, and then there was the Fenderman had.
Right. Now somebody can correct me on this, because I think that Mule Skinner Blues was actually cut at Kuka Studios.
Kuka Studios, yes.
Right?
Recut here.
Right.
Recut twice.
Well, I've heard that it's recut here, but man, if you play those two versions, they sound identical. I think that maybe they might have added a little reverb, but I don't think they re-recorded it here. That's a little piece of debate. But the Fenderman did record their other stuff here, right? The rest of the stuff on that record. But just getting back to 6 Days on the Road by Dave Dudley, if you listen to that record, I mean, especially compared to other country records of that era, I love country records that were recorded in Nashville just because of the incredible fidelity and the musicians that they had on that record. But man, 6 Days on the Road just explodes out of the speakers. And last night I was asking Tony, I was like, Jimmy Colvard, the guitar player on that, like, how did he get that sound, you know? He's like showing me how he just kind of flicked the strings. But, you know, if you listen to that record, that guitar just explodes out of the speakers. And I think, I don't know what the hell kind of magic they were doing or what Tom Jones was doing, but the unifying factors with so many of these records, whether it's 6 Days on the Road, which was a country record, or the Trashmen records, or the Underbeats, or the Accents, or the Gestures, or whatever, is, man, those records just kind of explode out of the speakers. And that's one of the things that I've just really, really loved about them. That basically covers everything that I wanted to say. I know that there's so many people here in the room that know way more than I do, but I will say that so many of our legendary recording studios across America have been bulldozed, you know, turned into condos. A buddy of mine here in town has a recording studio that he calls Future Condos Studios. Sad and hilarious at the same time. But whenever you're in one of these legendary rooms, I mean, I'm sure that most of you are able to do this, but you just gotta squint your eyes and think about all the incredible music that has happened in this room, and how lucky we are today to be joined by so many of the people that made that music. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.